In the last video, we left off talking about the adrenal medulla, which contains chromaffin cells. Chromaffin cells produce two hormones that you've probably heard of before. There's adrenaline, which we're going to call by its other name, epinephrine, and noradrenaline, which we're going to call by its other name, norepinephrine. The adrenal medulla is the major site of adrenaline or epinephrine production inside the body, so it's going to be the major thing that gets released out of the chromaffin cells. And we're going to talk more about what that does a little bit later in the course. So again, lots of diagrams here representing the same thing. So there's nothing new on this diagram, but one of the really nice things about this particular diagram is that we have color coding to help out with the terminology. So the preganglionic neurons are in brown and the postganglionic neurons are in that light blue color. So again, what we can see is that for most tissues, we have two neurons relaying the message to them. Switching gears a little bit to think about the parasympathetic division, we find preganglionic and postganglionic differences, like I said. The preganglionic differences are in where the neurons originate within the central nervous system. So remember that the sympathetic preganglionic neurons originate only within the spinal cord in the thoracic and lumbar segments. But the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons originate only at the very top and only at the very bottom of the central nervous system. In other words, we could find preganglionic parasympathetic neurons in the cranial nerves. Well, not in all of them, just in 4 of them. The oculomotor nerve, the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerves. You can come up with your own mnemonic to memorize them. But my favorite, well, actually I have 2 favorites. One of them is orange fruits give vitamins, and the other is only frat guys vape. Both of those mnemonics will give you the first letter of the 4 cranial nerves that have parasympathetic functions that are associated with them. So for example, the oculomotor nerve is normally important for moving your eyes around, but its autonomic function is to control the lacrimal glands or the tear glands inside of your eyes. Your facial nerve is important for taste and for facial expressions, but its autonomic function is to produce saliva. The glossopharyngeal nerve is important for moving around your tongue, but it also helps to regulate saliva production. And actually, most of the parasympathetic functions inside the body are due to cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus. The vagus is nicknamed the wanderer because it innervates all the way from your throat down into your abdominal organs. So out of the 4 of them, the vagus is actually the one that we'll be talking the most about, especially when we get into specific organ systems in the next half of the course. Honestly, it's almost always the vagus. Now, in addition to the cranial nerves, we also have some preganglionic neurons located down at the very bottom of the spinal cord in the sacral regions. Those neurons are typically going to be important for controlling your lower GI functions and some of your reproductive functions. So again, here's another view just representing some of the anatomy of the parasympathetic division, showing us again the preganglionic origins up at the very top and down at the very bottom. Now, in terms of the postganglionic structures for the parasympathetic nervous system, the really good news here is that we don't have to give any specific names to the ganglia for the parasympathetic division. The only thing that I want to point out is that if you take a look at the diagram on the left, which again is nicely color-coded to show the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, you can see that you have the preganglionic neurons in brown, the postganglionic neurons in light blue. And if you look closely at the diagram, you're going to see mostly brown. In other words, you really can't even see the light blue unless you look really, really closely. And that's because the parasympathetic division, all those preganglionic neurons, are actually really, really, really long. So instead of synapsing near the spinal cord, like we do in the sympathetic division, those preganglionic parasympathetic neurons actually travel all the way to the target tissue. And the ganglia is often located directly in the organ that they're regulating, or sometimes in the connective tissue wall that's just outside of the organ. So this means that the postganglionic neurons, which again are in light blue here, are usually really short because they only have to travel a really small distance to get into the tissues and find the cells that they're ultimately going to innervate and regulate. So the pattern that we'll often see in the parasympathetic division is that the preganglionic neurons are really long and usually myelinated because they have to travel that big distance from the central nervous system all the way to the target organ. The postganglionic neurons are short and may not even require myelin because they have such a short distance to carry.